Okay, stand by. We're launching in 3, 2, 1. Good luck. When it comes to horror games on the PC, it seems to be an endless pit comprised mostly of beautiful creativity and incompetent, cynical mediocrity. Ever since Amnesia came out back in 2010, completely revitalizing the genre, there have been so many games that have aped its style of no combat, just run from monsters and read notes. It was an era of Slender and Outlast clones, some good, some bad, but very few horror games moved past this formula at the time with two exceptions. Silent Hill 2 ripoffs, i.e. Bad Dad simulators, or they did even less than Outlast and simply made a glorified walking simulator. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to today's game, The Park. Developed and published by Funcom, the same team that gave us Conan Exiles, The Park is an example of games that dominated the PC market back in 2012. Set in the same universe of The Secret World, a 2012 MMO that had you battling occult forces across the globe, The Park was meant to be a little bit of an experiment for that kind of game. They wanted to see if they could take their action-based MMO and make little indie horror spin-offs of this game. Counting The Park, there are 3 games that have come from this endeavor. The other 2 are Hide and Shriek, a free-to-play one-on-one competitive multiplayer game, and probably more well-known, they made Moons of Madness. And funnily enough, just like The Park, Moons of Madness is also a story-driven first-person horror game, only this time, it's in space! Oh, and this is a small thing, but it's a much better game overall, but I'll get to that in the wrap-up. Right now, I just have to admire the ambition of Funcom to try and make such an interesting universe and spin it off into something completely original. It is kind of funny that most of these games ended up in the horror genre, but I guess when your main source of inspiration comes from a group of secret societies battling multiple forces of the occult all over the world, there are only so many types of games you can lean out of that, but hey, no complaints here. I'm honestly hoping the next one will be an adventure game Call of Cthulhu style. The game was relatively popular on YouTube. I definitely remember people like John Wolf, Markiplier, and a bunch of other LP channels playing it. Though, just because something is popular on YouTube does not mean that people bought it. One more thing I should say before we start this review properly, it's worth noting that I am playing the Nintendo Switch version of this game. Well, let's just say there's a reason I'm going to be talking about the graphics first. Alright, it's enough messing around. Let's dive into The Park. Okay, let's dive right into the technical aspects of this port. I think we can all agree that some companies really push it when it comes to getting a game onto the Switch, for better or worse. Some of it's impressive, like Doom Eternal or Alien Isolation, which from every hackjob port I've seen through hundreds of games, these are the best the system can offer. This game, on the other hand, it's a whole other story. It's closer to the bottom of the spectrum. While not the worst I've seen on the system, not by a country mile, the graphics are still terrible. There are a lot of muddy textures, loads of pop-in from just walking from point to point, and all of the characters have this ugly fuzziness about them. I think it's some heavy form of anti-aliasing to try to keep the frame rate up. Either way, it looks unappealing, and I really can't recommend this version of the game if you did decide to pick it up. Any other console port works, and of course you have the PC version. The frame rate for this game isn't terrible, it's fine, but I really wouldn't expect it to be bad since the gameplay consists of walking around and looking at stuff, so nothing ever really has the opportunity to tax the system. I'm shocked, honestly, for a game this simplistic. I do not know why it looks this way. I mean, here's some footage of a much more powerful game, Alien Isolation. It looks fantastic, on par with the PlayStation 4 version, and it holds a very solid 30 frames per second. So the question is, why can't this? And the answer is simple. Probably a simple case of a lazy port job. And believe me, that is common for the Nintendo Switch. Now, I will say that one place this game does excel in is the audio design, which arguably is the most important thing that a horror game needs to get right. Graphics aside, the game's mood and atmosphere is uncomfortable. The dark shadows cast over the rides and concession stands, the feeling of isolation in a location usually filled with the laughter of children and crowds of parents just trying to get their kid to the next ride. Even though you're searching for someone, you feel as though every second, every single moment that you are alone, and there is nothing you can do about it. And then the game ruins it by just trying to throw a pointless jump scare at you. It doesn't happen all the time, time, but it does disrupt the vibe when it comes along. It's like that one guy you barely know at work, and he suddenly decides to start palling around with you, and he just can't take the hint that you don't want him around, and I'm honestly sorry, Kyle. I thought we were friends. I'm sorry. I didn't know you felt that way. I think I said a bit too much. Let's move on to the actual gameplay. As I mentioned early on, the game can be classified as a walking simulator. Now, I'll get this out of the way really quick so people know where I stand on the subject. I don't hate walking sims. Games like Gone Home, Firewatch, and Dear Esther have long since proved that this style of game has a place in the infinite well that is the current gaming landscape. I believe that when done right, especially in the realm of horror, it can be incredibly effective as a genre to tell a game and a compelling narrative. Hell, one of my favorite horror games in recent years is Devotion, and that absolutely qualifies as a walking sim. However, on the other half of this double-edged sword, making a game this way can be incredibly dull with a lack of tasks to complete or interesting set pieces to look at. It takes a lot of talent and precise direction to get it right, so while I have a ton of respect for these games, it's rarely done in a completely satisfying way. So, with all of that being said, how does the park hold up on this little tier list? The answer is somewhere in the middle. It's not the worst, but it is not even close to the best. There are so many better games. Firewatch would be my recommendation for the one I'd say you absolutely have to play. Let's dive into why I think this. The game starts off with Lorraine, the main character, getting ready to take her son Callum home after a hopefully fun day at the park. Lorraine loses sight of Callum for a few seconds and he runs off into the park just as it's closing, but thankfully the ticket salesman lets you go get him. And this is where our game begins, on our endless run to get our son Callum back. You may have noticed I've been going through some severe links to not talk about the gameplay, and there's a reason for that. The gameplay is the most uninteresting aspect of the game. So once you get into the park and you start the story proper, you're free to explore, collect notes, and ride the rides. There's a very linear path the game is taking you down, but it really is up to you when you ride the rides, or even if you do, but I'll get into that part in a bit. Your walking speed is very slow, but thankfully they tossed in a sprint by just clicking in the left stick as you move. But I gotta be honest, I still think you move pretty slow throughout. I'm sure they did this intentionally to help with the game's creepy atmosphere, and fair enough, it can help having you forced to go so slow through the various parts of the map. On the flip side, it can be irritating when you know all that's coming is either nothing, a long-winded inner monologue, or a jump scare. You can examine items such as posters, notes, and some items hanging around to give you some context to the park itself. You get all sorts of little fun details from these, like the birth of the park, the people who worked there, the weird happenings over the years, and even some disturbing implications about Lorraine and the park's owner. Though the interact button doesn't work to carry items or do puzzles, and there are no weapons because there are no enemies at all. It's just looking at stuff, reading, and setting up for the next jump scare here and there. Finally, probably the most important mechanic here, and probably any game honestly, if we're gonna be honest, this is probably the most important and amazing thing the game has ever added. Any game has ever added, honestly. The Callum button. You can hit a button to call for your son, and yes, you know exactly where I'm going with this. Nothing comes from using it, it's more or less just to help you along with the story and put you in Lorraine's shoes. Let's talk about those rides, because it's the only thing about the park itself worth mentioning, and rightfully so. There are several attractions in the park, each of them adding something to the story along with more attempts to scare you. These are the big set pieces of the game, and they're not all bad. I'll walk you through a couple so you get an idea of what to expect, but we are not doing all of them because I want to finish this before I die. The first ride I'll talk about is, well, the first ride you get on. The Tunnel of Tales, or really, one tale. You hop on the Swan and you sit through the telling of Hansel and Gretel, and there aren't many spooks here, but the ride itself is kind of interesting. The story they pick to tell, the dark tunnels you ride through, it's all really creepy stuff. And there is a pretty uncomfortable ending to the story, as most grim fairy tales had, and then, oh my god, spooky swan face! A decent start to the game, and I think the most memorable part of the entire game, minus the ending. The last one I bring up before we dive into the story is the roller coaster. The only roller coaster in the entire park, and I gotta say, that's a ripoff. It feels like somebody's first attempt at Roller Coaster Tycoon. You hop onto the roller coaster, see a really creepy gentleman in a suit and cane. He honestly looks like the meth head version of Willy Wonka, and the ride begins. The hands of the gentleman reach at you from behind as the coaster moves on. He talks about Callum, how he is lost forever, and so is Lorraine. He says a witch has them both and how Callum will be fed to the park. And then this happens. This is probably my favorite set piece before the ending. It's quick, it gets the point across right away, and it's a great transition into that story that I'm sure you have all figured out at this point. If I'm being honest, I am not impressed with the gameplay at all. It's been the exact same thing over and over again with a couple exceptions. We can't go any further without dropping a huge spoiler tag on everything, so if you really want to see this game's story, which is literally the only thing this game has going for it, skip to this part in the video right here. If not, let's go. So, as I said earlier, the game starts outside Atlantic Island Park. Lorraine is in the parking lot with her son Callum, who for some reason runs back into the park. The ticket salesman lets you in to get him, and there seems to be a familiarity between the two, implying that she comes here all the time. Once inside, Lorraine explores the park and hops onto the rides, hoping to find Callum, all the while thinking to herself about her failings as a mother, the rough life she has led up to this point, and an odd fear that something is coming for her son. On the Ferris wheel, Lorraine talks about Dan, Callum's father, who worked at the park before he was born. She recalls him being the only good thing in her life and how it was so horrific that he died falling off the very Ferris wheel she is now riding. This whole time you're running from ride to ride, a creepy figure in a top hat keeps showing up at each ride. He even talks to you on the roller coaster. This figure is actually the park's owner, Mr. Winter, a man hell-bent on gaining immortality through the happiness of the children and families of the park. Now, what that actually means, I have no clue, but it seems to indicate that whatever happened to Atlantic Island Park before Mr. Winter bought it was of the occult. He knew this and wanted to take it for himself. This led to everyone working at the park living in fear as a ton of crazy accidents occurred at the park, including the death of Callum's father. One story even included the park's mascot, Chad the Chipmunk, taking an ice pick to a teenager. This incident, as well as a dozen children going missing inside the House of Horrors, led to the park being shut down for good. It is suggested in a message you find that Mr. Winter actually kidnapped at least one kid into the House of Horrors and killed him to extract his joy. Lorraine finds Callum running into the House of Horrors, where she talks about the story of Hansel and Gretel. She says in the original story the witch was actually the mother and suggests she is the evil witch harming Callum, that it was her fault that he ran off. The game then decides to pull a blooper team and puts us through a looping hallway where we get to see Lorraine's apartment throughout the years, how it got more and more decrepit, and how her mental state continued to decline. She couldn't handle being a single mother and started to neglect Callum. She hated him, and in turn hated herself for thinking this way. The game ends with Lorraine walking into a blank-looking room with Callum on the slab of a table. As she walks up to him, we see images of Chad the Chipmunk, and finally, the horrific image of Mr. Winters himself. He takes the ice pick into our hands and forces us to put it into our son. The final shot of the game fades into the police station where the detective, who looks just like the ticket salesman, is asking us questions. Lorraine then thinks to herself that every night she returns to Atlantic Island Park in her mind, and credits. Now, as straightforward as everything seems at this point, I think that there is a lot of room for interpretation within the story, given the universe that it takes place in. If you do know that it takes place in the secret world, you could make the argument that all of this supernatural occult stuff actually did happen, and it isn't just all in Lorraine's head. So it does give it the opportunity to go beyond just being a cliched psychological horror that Lorraine took the life of her son. I mean, maybe there was some occult force going on in the park, and when Lorraine took Callum, maybe she just lost track of him just long enough for him to be taken by Mr. Winters. We don't really know, and that's the part of the story that I really like. However, that's all in the context of if you know what's going on with the universe of the secret world. If you have no clue and you're just playing this like a standard indie horror game, nowadays in 2025, this is the most cliched story you can ever see. And there's a million games out there that do the exact same story
story, but even better. I do think the story is relatively interesting in its context, but outside of it, like I said, there's not much else to really dig in. I'd say it's a psychological horror game, but with a little bit extra, and that's me being generous.
That being said, this game has a lot of problems. For example, the length. So, playing this game for the review, it took me about an hour, including time to take notes. That is pretty bad for a game that costs $15 that has no real replay value. It is completely overpriced. Even some of the shorter horror games out there, like Scorn is a recent example, that game is 3 hours. And then it occurred to me, I wondered if I could run through this game without going to any of the rides, and if so, how fast could I do it? Well, I did. I ran through the entire game again, skipping as much as humanly possible. And guess what? I beat the game in 10 minutes. That is insane. That is shorter than this review. It is stuff like this that makes it really hard to recommend this game, since again, the story is all this game has going for it. And you know, it's good, but it's not even the best story out there. There are so many games that can give you an experience like this, or better, for less money. There's also a serious lack of things to do in the game. There's no puzzles or chase sequences or anything aside from notes and rides, both of which require little interaction. So on the gameplay half, this thing is lacking.
In the end, I just wanted more from this game. Its lack of real scares is the hardest part to deal with. It has no puzzles, it is just a straightforward linear walk from beginning to end, and as I showed just now, you can skip so much of this game if you just beeline it to the very end. I think Funcom knew this because they took another crack at it with another game called The Moons of Madness, which has more puzzles, leans harder on the Lovecraftian stuff, and is overall just a better game. Not perfect, but much better than this attempt. And that's the one I'd recommend unless you are just super curious. If you are curious enough to see what is going on, if you're a big Secret World fan, it might be worth checking out. For me, however, I'm probably never going to play this game again, and in the end, I will give The Park a 5 out of 10. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.